Again, super excited to talk about this episode, but first we are going to do our recap, which we always do, and we cut that out, host it separately on YouTube. So if you find yourself just on that recap and want to hear our full thoughts on the episode, it will be linked in the description below. But without further ado, if you would like to start us off, my friend.
Yeah, so the episode opens up with the party standing before this speaking mirror with Steel on the other side, seemingly about to tear Suvi a new one. And they essentially bring out this device, like this orb pedestal on a pedestal kind of thing. And Steel basically tells them, hey, I want you guys to put your hands on the orb. Ame is immediately extremely skittish to it and is kind of like, I'm not doing that. To which Steel's like, well, great. Your other option's prison, if that's what you'd prefer to do. They chat a little bit about it, and then finally it's kind of like, this is really the best option we have. And Steel informs them, I'm basically going to go into your mind and have a conversation with each one of you as to what's really going on here. Now, this episode's called Prisoner's Dilemma because of the prisoner's dilemma of basically how forthcoming are you, or do you all kind of unspokenly lie together? And this conversation that follows is actually fairly intense. Shout out to Taylor Moore. There are some really intense moments. Steel is going to have a one-on-one conversation in the mind of Ame, Suvi, and Ursulon. And there are some high points that come out of this. Steel is immediately very, I would say, kind and welcoming to Ame, and exchanges her regards for grandmother Rin having passed away, and basically says, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and pretty much asks, like, what's been going on, like what's been happening here. Meanwhile, with Ursulon, she's really asking the nature of how Ursulon came to be with the party. Now, the whole prisoner's dilemma piece, how that comes into play is Ame reveals to Steel that Ursulon is a spirit. Steel then also, and talking with Ursulon admits that he is in fact a spirit. Well, then in speaking to Suvi, Steel asks about the nature of Ursulon, and Suvi basically is forthcoming and says, yeah, he is a spirit. And Brennan has this cool sort of like tension cutting moment of, you realize in this moment that this was a very important test of honesty for Suvi, and she fortunately passed by being direct and honest about it. Now, from this moment on, it seems like the intensity of the moment is kind of subsiding. It definitely feels like Steel is on their side. Steel mentions that, hey, I have a lot to clean up because of you guys, but I'm not going to tell anyone here that Ursulon is a spirit. And additionally, really kind of catches up on like other extraneous details, like tell me about the sword. How did Ursulon get it? But there is a very interesting point of detail here. They talk about the main reason why Steel's orders were ignored was because they needed to figure out how to basically break this curse, how to basically get the sword to break the curse. And Steel basically says like, hey, this is priority number one. In fact, it's so much priority number one that if you guys were to break this curse, then the curse would be destroyed forever and we would never know who placed it on you. So I'd like to invite each of you to join me at the Citadel where we can study the curse. And when you break it, try to capture, I guess, look at the data code of its origin. Who knows magic in this world? And is like, we would like to see, to do it together so that we can kind of figure out who put this on you and for what purpose. Again, Ame is very suspicious. In fact, she flatly says no immediately, to which Steel says, I think Ame says something like, well, witches aren't welcome there. And Steel says, oh, well, Grandmother Rin came several times, which sort of stuns Ame. Ame's like, well, she never mentioned that. And Steel's like, oh, yeah. Grandmother Rin's come many times. I mean, it's your choice, but I'm definitely making Steel, by the way, sound more suspicious than I mean to. This is all fairly innocuous. I think just Will and I have kind of a tinfoil hat on about Steel, which I guess we'll talk about in the episode. But having said this conversation, Ame then kind of relents and says, well, all right, well, I'll think about it. And then essentially offers the same thing to Ursulon and then also to Suvi as well. In fact, lets Suvi know that because she is the Archmage Apprentice, there will be, I think, even like a court-martial hearing of some kind that she'll need to come be present at the Citadel for. The sort of mind vision device ends. Steele reminds them to kind of keep things locked down. Steele does inform Ame that as soon as she gets there, she is immediately priority number one going to free Naram and arrest Moro for his crimes against the spirits. And then also we find out that Suvi is, despite being best friends with Ursulon, has some fairly harsh feelings towards spirits in general, like many of the wizards in the Citadel. And Steele sort of presses against that a little bit and talks about how this was sort of this was their world that we sort of built around, that humans sort of took the origins of the spirit world to sort of design and create this world. And there is some sort of like owed respect there. Despite all of this, the party's given the order to just lay low again. And surely that's it. Nothing happens after that. Surely they wait. Will, you want to take the second half?
Yeah. And Steele did let it be known that like she was going to free Naram and like set this all right. And so everyone's kind of like, okay. And they are heading back to the Chantry, and Ursulon, knowing that things are going to be set right tomorrow, goes to his room, but he sees the coral ring on the table that he had left there. And the ring makes this excitement for potentially going to the Citadel and getting trained, by the warriors there. It all just washes away because he sours and remembers Naram, and that they have to wait a whole day to do anything about it. So he just angrily draws Wavebreaker and swings on the ring. And Brennan has this nice line about the sword being for most of his life this gift from Suvi. It wasn't something he chose. He and his friends found it and they just decided it should be his. But in this moment, this is his sword and it belongs to him. And Brennan actually has him make a dexterity save for swinging. And he hits an 18, and he describes the ring just sundering and it, scattering into a million pieces, and also blood kind of coming out and scattering as he does this. And it's kind of pulsing, this blood, as if there was still life force in it. And Brennan describes Ursulon seeing like this eye within the blood, and it's Naram's eye. And Ursulon hears this voice, and it says, "Little cub, I am glad to see you have grown." And Ursulon somehow recognizes this voice. And so he goes and tries to gather as much of this scattered blood as he possibly could that has gone across the room. And he's also breaking more things in the room. And Brennan actually has him make a constitution save for each thing he decides to break. And the very first thing, the bed, he hits a natural 1. So it's described as like these cuts on Ursulon's arm start, like the blood from Naram's blood like goes into his open wounds, and he starts having a seizure essentially. And as he does, he kind of enters this vision, and in this vision he is barely a cub. His father, the Great Bear, is standing atop a mighty waterfall, and Ursulon actually falls into the waterfall and gets swept away into the sea. However, he sees a beautiful man with a long spear who approaches him, who is very friendly, and he says like, "Oh, little lost cub, hold on." And basically like this mist surrounds Ursulon that allows him to breathe underwater, and Naram basically like picks him up in the palm of his hand and ultimately returns him to his father. Interesting kind of scene here that we might talk more about, but Ursulon's father is like, "Oh, did you save him? Like, was he weak?" And Naram's like, no, of course not. I was worried for my fish. Here, like, I brought your son back to you. And he tells Ursulon, "I hope I see you again one day." It's after this that Ursulon awakes to Ame checking on him, and he tells her all about the vision. And Ursulon's like, "I have known his kindness. Like, I'm going to free him right now." And Ursulon basically sprints to the armory, and Ame's like, "Wait, what the heck?" And she follows him. There's no one in the armory, thankfully. He grabs another cool ring and tries to put it on, but again, Constitution save, and he fails. So his body is rejecting the ring, so he throws it off. And he's like, "We have to free him right now. He deserves to be freed. I'm going." And Ame notices that there's something kind of weird about his fur, but more on that in a second. So Urslan sprints out of the armory and is headed toward the docks. Ame goes after him and she calls for the fox, like, "Hey, like, come on, we're going." Meanwhile, we cut back to Suvi's room, and Moro has come to her door, sucking up like he always does, being like, "Hey, where'd you go off to today?" And Sui's like, "Not tonight." She says, "Steel will be here tomorrow. Don't bother me." Back to Urslan and Ame. Ame screams for Suvi as she's just like running down the street. She just says, "Suvi!" So Suvi can hear this and she goes out to her window and can see her friend sprinting toward the water. But Suvi has this moment, after getting ridiculed by Steel, and she's like, "I can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results."
Right.
So instead of following her friends, she goes down to their rooms to see if she can kind of piece together what may be
Right.
going on, and she can see all the destruction in Urslan's room, and so she decides to spend the night mending the bed and mending everything he broke, and will not join her friends. Cut back to them though. Urslan sprints down the dock, dives in the water. He's far ahead of Ame. So as she's catching up, she's like, "Well, what do I do?" And she tries to get in a nearby rowboat, but as she does, there's like an Imperial ship going by, and they're like, "Hey, what are you doing? Like, we
Yeah.
could clearly see you stealing this ship."
Yeah.
And she tries to talk her way out of it, but like does not get anywhere. So ultimately, she cannot follow Urslan, and he is alone. And as he's swimming to the derricks, swimming to Naram, he decides, like, "I'm not going to come up for air. Like, I'm just going straight down to it." And Brennan has to make a con save, 14, and he sucks in water. Like, he can't hold his breath any longer. But he comes to realize that it feels like air to him. The magic of the ring that he destroyed and Naram's blood that entered his system is kind of giving him the same boon that the coral ring would have, so he can breathe underwater. Because the magic was Naram's all along. So he swims and he finally makes his way to the base of this derrick. And he happens to see a fish swim in between the plane of like the derrick, and it just gets sliced in half immediately. And he realizes there's these eyes at the different points of the derrick that are serving as kind of like an invisible force field. But he does realize that the eye has to see in order to enact. It's not based on movement, it's based on sight. So Urslan is like, "What do I do here? What would Suvi do in this moment?" And then he realizes, "I can go invisible and I'm going to have to try it." So he does just that and successfully crosses through the barrier, swims down to Naram and tells him, like, "I'm going to make this right." And he is just surrounded by blood here because Naram is like constantly bleeding from this wound beneath him. Um, he introduces himself to Naram as Urslan and says, like, "Hey, they're using your blood up there." And Naram's like, "They only think they do, but my blood went out into the world and it has brought me you. Like, my blood is protecting me, and they don't even realize like what they've gotten into." Um, but he also realizes in this moment that he is not so much trapped. Naram could free himself at any moment, but doing so would cause such a tidal wave that Port Talon would be destroyed. And he also reveals that he's being pinned down by his own spear. That's how they've captured him here. But he tells Urslan, "Perhaps if you can strike true with Wavebreaker, we can have the best of both worlds. I can be freed and we can spare Port Talon." So, can you find it in yourself to feel your breath and strike true? And so Urslan unsheaths Wavebreaker, and there's this great line that says, "Are you fast enough to hold the part of you that is eternal?" Um, and he will walk this path of danger and stand for the brighter tomorrow. He brings the sword high above his head, and he accepts that this is the world, that this is a world where that is not upheld, but that doesn't mean you are scared and step aside, because to have honor is to meet it head on. And so he swings down the sword. And Brennan, I know I'm getting long-winded, but this is also good.
So freaking
Brennan, Brennan explains that in a story governed by dice rolls, I can say that this roll will change the fate of this campaign. Whether this succeeds or fails can completely alter all of the events to come. You're making a straight attack roll, but should you choose, you can make it with advantage, with the trade-off being that you might end up being trapped here in Naram's place. Lou accepts that trade and rolls with advantage, and he gets an 18 and a 23. And Brennan says, Knights left this world long ago, but a knight is someone who chooses danger for themselves over danger for another. If you do that, our knight's truly gone. The sword comes down, and that's where the episode ends. Left on this massive cliffhanger. But a fantastic episode 12 of The Wizard, the Witch, and the Wild One, Prisoner's Dilemma. Again, if you're just on the recap and want to hear our full thoughts, it will be linked in the description below.